super exciting to have Jaspreet Kaur with me because I can't believe it. I'm so
Oh,
excited. This is such a major achievement, Jaspreet. Like, honestly, to write a book about the brown diaspora in Britain, especially. It's just we never ever hear of it, especially in terms of brown women in Britain. Although we've had such a significant impact on the environment. So
yeah.
I'm super excited that you've written it. So thank you.
No, no, thank you. And thank you so much for providing this time and this space just to talk about this book and why it's so important and why we needed this book now is definitely something we can cover. So thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
Yay. Okay, so I'm going to do a brief introduction and then I cannot wait to get like really
Yeah,
into it now.
get in.
Yes, so woohoo. So Jaspreet Kaur is an award-winning spoken word artist, history teacher and writer from London. She is passionate about gender issues, taboo subjects and encouraging positive social change in both the Asian community and wider society. Her work both tackles issues related to gender discrimination, mental health stigma, the post colonial immigrant experience, and much, much more. She is actually a regular on the BBC and Sunday Morning Live, which is exciting, and also has worked with the UN, which, hello, on the He for She campaign. I'm really excited to hear that you're a research fellow at Birkbeck University Centre for British Political Life, and Brown Like Me is her debut book. Okay, so let's get into it. So, what inspired you to write this book, first of all?
Oh, good question to start with. And what an introduction. Thank you so much. Such a lovely introduction. So what inspired me to write this book? Well, I guess this is really the book I wished existed, right? This is the book growing up as an Asian girl, living in London, born and raised in the Western world, but never quite understanding how to navigate our identity here. And just the book I wished I had, with all the tips, the tricks, the tools, and bits of advice to know that I'm not alone in this. And and it really is that, this kind of toolkit. We're calling it a guidebook, we're calling it a call to arms, we're calling it a brown girl manifesto, because it really does feel like that it's been a long time coming, that there hasn't been a book like this for Asian women like myself. And when I was researching kind of previous books like this, a non-fiction book for Asian women, the last book like this was written in the late 70s, so in 1978, by an amazing woman called Umrit Wilson, author and activist. And I was like, how can it be almost 40 years since a book like this has been created? And don't get me wrong, there's been biographies by other Asian women
Mm,
in recent
yeah.
years. So there has been some fiction and some non-fiction coming out from Asian women, but there hasn't been this kind of collective non-fiction book about our experiences collated in this way. And I was like, what? How has that not happened? So that's what I've been doing over the last couple of years. I've been speaking to Asian women from across the country, as well as interweaving some of my own stories and experiences, and also bringing in some of my academic insight from kind of my academic background in history and in gender studies, and also as an educator, as a teacher, bringing in all those kind of pieces of information together to create this book. And it really covers a range of different themes, everything from mental health to love to body image to cultural appropriation to parenthood. It's really kind of picked out some of the key issues that I felt Asian women were trying to navigate in these last couple of years. So yeah, that's kind of what inspired me to write it. It's the book I wished existed, and I really hope it helps many other Asian women as well, kind of taking the wheel in their lives, helping them navigate going forward, and essentially feeling empowered and feeling inspired from this book. So yeah, that's why I set out to write it.
That's excellent. I can't believe it. 40 years since the last book.
Mm.
That's just crazy. And you're right. I've seen loads of memoirs and
Mhm.
biographies, but very few kind of collations. Like you
Mm.
see in, say, the African American diaspora, where you
Absolutely.
see a lot of academic
Yeah,
work, which,
there's been
yeah,
fantastic work, and I think some of that definitely has inspired me over the years. So I do give a huge amount of credit in the book when I'm kind of recognizing what has inspired me in the years. That the many Black feminists and Asian feminists in the Eastern world that have inspired a lot of my work. But I did see a lot of
mm,
text coming out in the recent years from kind of Black feminists and Black scholars. Books like British by Afua Hirsch.
yeah,
We've got Why I No Longer Want to Talk to White People About Race
mm,
by Renee. So we've had these really significant texts coming out in the last couple of years. But again, there was just nothing for Asian women. And even though we could definitely resonate with a lot of those experiences from the
mm.
Black community and fellow women of color, I just feel like there wasn't anything specifically for our communities out there. So yeah, it's been a long time coming.
Definitely. God, yeah, no, it's so true. And I thought it was really interesting in terms of obviously the contrasts and the contradictions between sort of the experiences of brown women and their white counterparts. And what do
Hmm.
you think is the biggest difference in terms of the experiences?
Oh gosh, the biggest difference. That's a really great question, actually. I guess I've highlighted quite a few in the book,
Mm,
and just kind of from the top of my head, the ones that I think are really significant are number one, that the health inequalities going on. And what I mean by that is health inequalities in a number of different ways. And in the book, I've highlighted mental health inequalities, but I've also looked at things like menstruation, which is a kind of big taboo
mm,
topic within the South Asian community, but other health inequalities that we as Asian women are going through, and how for most health issues, we as brown women are significantly suffering more likely to be diagnosed with certain issues, more likely to contract certain health issues, and combine that,
mm,
these health inequalities, combining that with also the nuances of the fact that Asian women may not speak up about some of these inequalities, especially when it comes to their health.
mm,
If they are suffering mentally, if they are suffering physically, we are not good at putting ourselves first or putting our health first. We're very good at putting other people first and putting other needs before our own. But imagine that kind of really toxic combination of not centering ourselves and not putting our own health needs first, and combining that with a health system that doesn't really care about women of color either. And there's really shocking statistics in the book about women of color being more likely to die during childbirth, women of color more likely to suffer from depression and anxiety, or to be misdiagnosed when they do go seek help. So there are some really shocking statistics in there about those health inequalities going on for women of color. So I guess that's kind of one of the most prominent ones when we think about health, and when we look at that in combination with comparing that to our white counterparts and how we're not on a even playing field. um, I
mm.
guess that's probably the one that jumps out to me the most. And following on from that, I guess some of the other inequalities I've kind of shared in the book is definitely in the academic space, in the
Mm,
workplace, how even though Asian women are academically some of the smartest women in the country, academically we're achieving very well. We're kind of the
mm,
second smartest cohort in the country academically, but that's just not being reflected in schools. It's not being reflected in academic institutions. It's not being reflected in the workplace. We're just not seeing Asian women being conveyed in that way. We're still being
mm,
treated as those same old really tired narratives that Asian women are quiet and weak and submissive and all of these things. And if anything, imagine those labels continuously being put onto us. It does become a self-fulfilling prophecy, because if nobody's
yeah.
believing in you, no one's encouraging you, no one's providing you with these opportunities, then these things just keep happening. So I guess that's kind of the two key areas where I feel the biggest differences between, say, Asian women and their white counterparts is definitely these health inequalities, and I feel that's a really
Mm.
urgent thing that needs to be considered. But also what's happening in the academic space, in educational spaces, and the workplace as well.
Yeah, completely. God, I think I remember reading some really shocking statistics about women in India, like the suicide rate of the
Mm,
world.
mm,
It was like one of the highest rates, and the majority of like suicide were coming from women in India. And I was just
mm.
like, that's just toxic, isn't
Terrifying.
it?
Mm.
And so I was just wondering, we've touched upon this, is why do you think there's like an ingrained acceptance of secrecy when it comes to mental health?
This secrecy, this stigma around mental health was one of the kind of key things I wanted to tackle through this book, and it was something I was debating for a while, especially considering the mental health chapter is actually the first chapter of the book. Chapter one, Brown and Down, is considering the mental health experience for South Asian women, and I was in two minds about that. About do I really want to start this book with a really
Mm,
heavy topic, a really heavy issue? But I'm really glad I did, because I wanted to start from this place of discussing our mental health, because before we can figure anything else out, I think that was the first thing we needed to consider, our own mental well-being, and starting from that place of vulnerability. And this stigma, this thing that's been holding us back for so long, about not talking about our mental health, about keeping it a secret, about brushing it under the carpet, and some of those kind of anecdotal stories I've mentioned in the book, not only from my own life but other Asian women being told
mm,
that they can't speak about their mental health because people look, they'll call you crazy, or what will the
mm,
aunties say about you, or if people find out you've got these mental health problems, you'll never get married. And that was a really common thread, that apparently an Asian woman's only aspiration in life is to get married. So if she's got mental health problems, then she can't get married. And all
mm,
these really strange concepts around izzat and honor that we just really need to untangle, because it's not only affecting the younger generation of Asian women, and that's kind of millennial women like ourselves or Gen Z generations, but these things are impacting our mothers, our grandmothers, and they've been impacting them for so long. And I've really highlighted that issue of kind of intergenerational trauma, about how our
yeah,
ancestors, our grandparents, our parents, considering the amount of things that they had to go through, everything from partition to mass migration to poverty to then migrating to
mm,
new countries, all of that amount of trauma that they're probably holding inside of them has then passed on to these next generations, because they never had a chance to deal with it. And understandably so. If
mm,
you think about the context of our grandparents and our parents, I completely understand that context of wanting to set a foundation for their family, working those long hours. They never had a chance to consider their mental health, so they were still holding these cultural contexts of keep it quiet and carry on.
mm,
But I really do feel we are the generation that can change that, and hopefully help previous generations too, hopefully help our parents and grandparents along the way. But we are the generation of healing. And I know that sounds like a really lofty statement, and it's quite a big burden to bear. But I do feel we are the generation of healing, because I think we are now the first generation that are considering all these mental health problems that are on in
mm,
our community. And sometimes they're reflected in really different ways. Sometimes it's not as obvious as maybe depression or anxiety, but stuff like
mm.
alcoholism and addiction
Oh God, yeah.
and abuse and all these other horrible things that are going on amongst our communities are a reflection of these mental health problems. They're just being
Mm,
conveyed in different ways. And I think it's about time we now tackle them, stop this stigma, we start talking about it, we start looking for the help that we need, and then also expecting those services out there, especially here in the UK and in the Western world, providing adequate services for us. And I really do highlight that in the mental health chapter about this idea of cultural sensitivity is really needed amongst our mental health services to know what it's like for Asian women. Because I remember
Mm-hmm.
the first time I went to see a therapist, I was at uni and it was a white female therapist in her kind of 40s. And when I was describing to her a lot of the struggles I was going through, her suggestion was that I should leave my family home and kind of abandon my culture and my family and all those things. And that's what's going to help me feel better. And in my head, I was like,
Mm,
well, that's not going to make me feel better. That's going to make me feel even worse and more confused. So there was that real lack of kind of cultural empathy and cultural sensitivity of understanding, okay,
mm-hmm.
this is what Asian women have to go through. There are things that we need to say no to and set boundaries around, but just more advice on how to navigate some of those situations with that cultural sensitivity. So yeah, that's what that chapter is really highlighting. And I feel the change is coming. I definitely feel there's quite a
Mm,
shift happening right now. If you look at some of the services that are out there, the conversations and discussions that are going on, the new initiatives that are happening, I think there's definitely a shift
mm-hmm.
happening. um, I think we just need to keep that going and keep that moving, and no more suffering in silence. I really feel that needs to end with our generation so that our kids and our kids' kids never have to go through these things alone ever again.
Yeah, totally. It's so weird that you said that because I had exactly the same sort of situation where
Mm.
the first thing a white therapist told me was, uh, "That's very common in your culture, isn't
Mm.
it?" And I was just like, not necessarily."
Yeah. Yeah.
And it was just like that's a very sweeping statement.
Very serious. Yeah. A lot of these
So
assumptions. Yeah. Mm.
yeah, and especially when you start creating an homogenous group and referring
Mm.
to they and things like that, you realize there's a real problem in
Mm.
that kind of reaction. So I totally agree with you, and it's really heartening to see a lot of yeah, and you've mentioned this, which is like seeing South Asian therapists, these groups that are
Mm.
coming out that are taking charge of the mental health space
Mm.
for South Asian people. So that's really exciting,
Yeah.
and it's really interesting because you're talking about healing, which is true. It's so important, and you mentioned like a collective sense of healing for
Mm.
you started at home. So
Mm.
would you say that's similar for everyone, or do you think it's different for everyone?
Absolutely. I think it definitely is different for everybody. And I completely appreciate that sometimes it may not be the case that you can find that healing at home. It may be the case that people don't want to change, or you can't find that sense of healing in the home space. So I definitely understand that that can't always be the case. But if there is opportunity for that growth and opportunity for that place of discussion, and there's kind of tips and advice on how to do that within the book, about making this time for talk and making this
Mm,
time for some of these awkward dinner table conversations, as I call them, then do try and make space for that. But I appreciate that's not the experience for everyone. And it was the same for me. That was how things were for me for a very long time. Even within my home and
mm,
within my family, we didn't speak about these things. Everybody
mm,
within my family, whether they were suffering from any mental health issues or not, were just not speaking to one another about
yeah.
these things because they were so taboo. And if maybe we did bring them up, it would be shut down quite quickly. So it did take quite a long amount of time to get to this point. And in the book I mentioned that it was not very long ago. It was when I was deciding to do my TED talk on how poetry saved my life. So I was looking at
Mm,
how creative writing and poetry was a really therapeutic tool for me during the years that I didn't have any mental health support outside of that. Before I was about to do that TED talk, I realized that, okay, I'm about to step on a stage in front of 1,200 strangers about my mental health story, but I hadn't even spoken to my mum and dad about it. And I was like,
right.
well, TED has this global platform. It's going to be all over the internet. It's going to be all over the world. it's about time I have this conversation with my parents. And I was at a stage in my life where I was starting to feel more secure in who I was and what I wanted in life. And that's when I had that conversation with them. And it was a really difficult conversation. There was lots of questions. Some of them still stigmatized questions, but we really had to kind of work through those. Um, keep having those discussions, and ultimately I wanted my parents to see that it also impacted them too, that I know
Mm.
that our families and our parents and our grandparents have suffered. They do have
Yeah.
these mental health issues. They've just never been able to articulate it because perhaps they didn't have the language to do that. And I don't mean that in terms of language as in the English language, because it doesn't
Mm.
necessarily always translate to what we feel in our home languages. But it is that thing of were they never able to let it out and articulate it because they were never given that space or never given the language to do it. So when I said to my mum, I
Mm.
gave her an example and I said to her, my mum suffers from claustrophobia. And to her, she
Mm.
was like, to me, that just means I can't be in small spaces. And I was like, Mum, that's actually a form of anxiety that you can't be in small spaces. She hates being anywhere without a window. Or even on an
Mm.
aeroplane, she does get quite anxious, but she's never articulated it in that way. She's just said, "Oh, I just don't like places without windows." That's how, even when I was little, I remember she wouldn't go into bathrooms that didn't have windows. It was just kind of always this thing. And I remember once
Mm.
we went on holiday. It was like our first holiday somewhere, and the room was like a basement room. And now reflecting back on it, it was probably an anxiety attack, a panic attack that she was having. But
Right.
she was like, I don't want to stay in this room. And we had to change to another room. And I remember that happening when I was quite young. But she would have never said that is a mental health issue. She would describe it as something
Mm.
different. But when I showed that to her, I was like, Mum, these things that you've been feeling for a very long time about not wanting to be in small places is called claustrophobia. It's a form of anxiety of being in spaces like that. Then she started to
Mm.
understand it. She was like, well, yeah, my chest tightens. I can't breathe. I feel nervous. I was like, well, that's how it feels like when I'm having panic attacks or when I'm having anxiety
Mm.
attacks. That's what it feels like. So there was that level of kind of empathy that grew. But again, it took time. And I guess my advice to people that do want to find a sense of healing within their home, if there is space to have some of this dialogue and discussion, then do make space for that, do make time for that. And there's now lots of resources out there on finding that support within communities too. There's a lot of kind of
Mm.
community spaces looking at this sort of stuff. Even places of worship are looking at these things too. So in the Sikh community,
Mm.
within our Gurdwara, within the Hindu community, within temples, within the Muslim community, within mosques and community spaces, they're now making space for it in those spaces too of talking about our mental health. And I think that's helping the
Mm.
older generation because they're seeing that, okay, I'm seeing that it's in these places too. They're talking about these things, and that's starting to normalize it, I think, a little bit more.
Yeah, completely. Exactly, because those are areas where they're used to kind of going to, and then suddenly they're also talking about it. So it makes
Mm.
total sense, and it's very interesting that you're. Yeah, I remember reading about this claustrophobia, and then,
Mhm.
yeah, exactly the fact that your mum realized actually this is part of this
Mm.
spectrum, isn't it?
Mm.
I actually thought, but you know what I thought was really interesting. It's like, well, first of all, I just want to describe the fact that in front of every single chapter is a beautiful poem
Mm.
written by you. And I was just wondering, how did you know that poetry would be your outlet? Like,
Mm.
how did you know that was the creative outlet that was going to help you?
Oh, yeah. I'm really glad you mentioned the poetry actually, because a lot of people have been asking, when will we get to see your poetry? Obviously, I've been a spoken word poet for the last 6 years. I've been writing poetry since I was 13, but a lot of people have known me for being a spoken word poet. So I think maybe they were expecting a poetry collection to come out first. But
Mm.
I have been telling them that there is poetry in this book, and you're absolutely right. Every chapter starts with a poem. Um, and I guess the reason why I wrote poetry and the reason why it's in this book and why I want to keep pursuing it and why poetry specifically is because when I first started writing poetry, it was purely as an outlet for myself. It was purely as a way to let out a lot of the emotions I was bottling in as a teenager. But in recent years, when I started doing spoken word poetry and performance poetry, and even my very first performance was a poem called Queens and Corpses, and it's about the ongoing sun preference in South Asian communities.
Mm.
From that point, I realized that poetry and the arts can be a really accessible way for us to talk about some of these really hard topics and these taboo topics and these things we want to brush under the carpet. And if anything, it's kind of a softer entry point, because sometimes being just spoken at, or hearing a speech, or reading
Mm.
a big text or book might feel like too much. But with poetry, with a
Mm.
spoken word poem, and specifically hearing it being spoken, and that's why I do identify as a spoken word poet, because I always tell people to listen to my poems out loud when I read them aloud, because there's
Mm.
something about hearing it that really resonates with people. I think it's something that's accessible, and they feel it connects to them in a very different way. So that's why I think poetry is going to be a form that I still want to develop, and I'll keep working on, and I love performing, because it is accessible. I can just feel it in the room, when I'm performing to audiences, and seeing in their faces them really connecting to the words that I'm saying. So yeah, poetry is very powerful, and often people ask me, okay, what poets inspire you, or did you grow up reading Shakespeare? And don't get me wrong, I grew up here in the UK, so we had an English curriculum that had all these poets, and from everyone from Shakespeare to some of the other famous poets here in the Western world. But we as the South Asian community, poetry is a huge part of our heritage and a
Mm.
huge part of our identity. Specifically in the Sikh faith, even our holy scriptures, our Bani is written in poetic
Oh, yeah.
form. But then if you look at the wider
Mm.
South Asian continent, we've got beautiful poetry gathered there from all different communities, from the Pakistani community, the Bangladeshi community, Sri Lankan
Yeah.
community, and across India in lots of different forms. So poetry is a big part of who we are. Um, and it's important. I don't want us to forget that. And if anything, there's now a
Mm.
revival, and I'm feeling that kind of revival of the arts happening in lots of different forms, whether that's dance, poetry, painting, sculptures. We're seeing a lot of
Mm.
this kind of creative work coming back now. So it's definitely worth leaning into our home cultures, because there's lots of inspiration there.
Yeah, that's so true. Actually, I haven't even thought of that, which is, yeah, exactly. I have like far too many hobbies, but just, like,
That's a good
yeah,
thing.
it's, yeah, far too many hobbies. But yeah, exactly. When I draw, I always forget to maybe actually look into like Asian art, which obviously is just
Mm.
incredible in itself, which is so true.
Mm.
Yeah, thanks. Food for thought. I will definitely keep an eye out for that.
Yeah, no,
Yeah,
definitely.
but
On that note
but,
about art,
oh
sorry,
yeah.
you just mentioned about Asian art. I worked on a project a few years ago. It's a coloring book, the Seat coloring book.
Oh.
And the reason why we wanted to work on that book, I came on as an editor for the book, so I kind of helped with some of the information that's alongside some of the coloring pictures. And we commissioned Sikh artists to create those pieces of work, and hopefully some of
Hmm.
the later volumes are now going to look at other communities within the South Asian community. So
Wow.
Islamic art from the
Wow.
Hindu community, Buddhist community, and finding artists there to help create these coloring books. But that was one of the reasons why, because we wanted to show that art is a big thing in our communities. Let's encourage that.
Mm.
Let's revive that as much as possible.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Wow, that's so exciting. I'm going to go and check it out because yeah,
Mm.
that is awesome. Because you're right, we don't see it in the mainstream, especially like British mainstream, to see anything from our background. And obviously, you as an educator have had like first-hand experience of basically the lack of sort of education given
Mm.
to sort of people of color. So I'm just wondering, what is the best way for educational institutions to support brown girls?
Oh, really good question. This is a really good question. This is what I was trying my best to navigate in chapter two, in Beyond the Classroom, about what can these institutions do better. And there's a multitude of different things, but I guess specifically in the education space, we do need to see a top down approach. We do need to see from top down, and that means from government level to leadership levels within schools, really considering how they can do better for students of color. And there's a
Mm,
multitude of different ways that I've suggested in this book, from everything from looking at the curriculum, and can we diversify and make our curriculums more inclusive so that they do
mm,
include histories and stories of people of color. It's just, it's mad to me
yeah.
that we as South Asian kids, black kids, or any other kids from kind of ethnic minority backgrounds are in schools and make up a large percentage of our schools here in the UK, but then we're learning a curriculum that has nothing about us. And that's not only in the history curriculum, which is what obviously I specify in as a history teacher, but also across the board, whether we're teaching English, maths, science, it doesn't matter what subject we're talking about, looking at that curriculum and really thinking about,
Mm,
are we engaging with all the students in this classroom? Does this feel relatable? Does this feel engaging? So I think the curriculum is definitely one space we can do that. But
mm,
a few of the other suggestions in the book are thinking about having more teachers of color in the classroom.
yes.
Because I
Hmm.
definitely grew up not having many South Asian teachers, not having many Black teachers, especially in a diverse array of subjects.
Yeah.
So getting more teachers of color in the classroom, because I think that can definitely impact young people seeing teachers that look like themselves, that come from the communities that they come from, and also seeing them as role models as well. I think kind of role models and
Mm,
mentors is something I recommend a lot within this book, about the young people need to see these role models in these different positions to look up to. And not to say that those teachers of color should do all the work. And that's something I've
mm,
highlighted, that all the labor shouldn't be on them to diversify the curriculum, or to handle everything on gender and race, because that can often happen. And it happened sometimes when I was teaching, that everything to do with any inequality, so whether that was gender, race, sexuality, disability, anything to do with any inequalities, let's give that to Jaspreet because she's
oh
the
God.
different one. It shouldn't all be put on those teachers. Everybody needs to be doing the work, and everybody needs to be doing the
Yeah.
self education. And as well as kind of policy changes, I think there's kind of coming from that level, if certain policies change within schools, to have more of this cultural sensitivity, to be helping children of color, brown girls, feeling like they're being motivated, and seeing that they're being inspired and empowered, is what we need to see. We need to stop seeing Asian girls as the quiet, submissive, meek ones in the classroom,
Mm,
and see them as
yeah.
individuals and see how we can inspire them, because that's not happening enough. And one of the examples in the book,
No.
about an example from a school of how, even in seating plans, teachers would put an Asian girl next to a more disruptive student, because they would think, okay, she's good, well behaved, and smart, so let's put her next to a disruptive student to keep them settled. How is that fair? That is just, yeah, yeah. There's a lot of changes that need to happen in the educational system, but top down, and then we can look at bottom up, and then the other side ways, and tackling it from all directions. But I think it needs to happen from top down, and then we can figure out some of these other ways to make sure brown girls do feel like they're being valued within the education system.
Yeah, no, definitely. And yeah, as you say, like history is so important, and and obviously it's very individual to everyone. But I was just wondering, like, how do you think we can explore our own histories to sort of to get a better sense of self?
Really good question. And this is something I highlighted towards the end of the chapter, about the reason why I called it Beyond the Classroom, was because we can't rely on academic institutions to supply all this education to us and this knowledge to us. A lot of it has to be this self work and this self education that we as brown girls need to do, because we can't be relying on other people to do it for us. We never know when it's going to change, depending on what government's in power, depending on what party's in power, depending on what happens in that country politically, socially, culturally. Things are always going to change. So we can't rely on these institutions to do that for us. So we need to be doing some of that self work. And I've suggested a few different ways to do that, whether that's reading a diverse array of workbooks, looking into the history of your own identity and culture. Because before you ask anybody else to understand who you are, you need to understand who you are first, right? So understanding some of those bits about what makes you a brown girl, your history, where you come from, where your family comes from,
Yeah.
things about your parents. That's another thing that's come up in the parenthood chapter. About there was this really interesting research study about how the most confident children and the most confident young people, the ones that feel quite self assured and confident and do well academically, are the kids that know the most about themselves and their family history.
Mm.
So there's actually a quiz that you can do online. It's like a number of different questions that you can go away and ask yourself, like, do you know the answer to these questions? So for example, do you know how your parents met? Do you know where your grandparents came from? Do you
Mm.
know just these certain things about your identity and what makes you who you are? And I fully appreciate that not everybody can do these things. There might be certain circumstances or family structures that don't allow you to do some of that work. Perhaps you don't know your parents. Perhaps you come from a foster
Mm.
background. Perhaps there are certain reasons why you might not know that. However, is there anything you can be doing to really understand who you are the best way possible? So doing kind of some of
Mm.
that work about learning about who you are. And as well as that, one of the big other recommendations I give in the book is looking for role models, looking for mentors, looking for people to look up to provide you with some of that support, advice, and
Mm.
education that you might not necessarily get in the classroom. And I've named kind of a
Yeah.
couple of great organizations. One of the ones that I support is called the Girls Network, and they match up mentees with mentors from across the country, women from a diverse array of backgrounds, from different career backgrounds and different ethnic backgrounds, matching them up with a young girl around the age of kind of 15, 16 onwards, to help navigate their journey going forward. And I'm really grateful that in the recent years I've found myself a couple of mentors professionally and
Mm.
personally, that every time I'm a bit confused or stuck or not sure on how to navigate certain situations, these are the people that I lean on. So yeah, that's another piece of advice on what we can be doing ourselves for some of this self
Mm.
education, this self learning, and not relying purely on these institutions to do it for us.
Yeah, for sure. And
Mhm.
yeah, and there's just so much in terms of several chapters on also the commodification and then also appropriation, which
Mm.
bug the hell out of me, obviously.
Mm.
And so I'm these are subjects that really just great on so many Asian women's. It's just ridiculous. So for one, beauty standards, obviously, it's
Mm.
just so confusing
Mm.
because, on the one hand, Asians are sort of told to look whiter.
Mm.
On the other hand, there's, rich white people tanning, paying lots of money to tan.
Yeah, the irony.
I know. And it's like, okay, so why do you think it's so confusing?
Mm. Yeah, the beauty standards, that chapter on body hair and colorism and everything kind of around brown bodies is a really interesting one, because there are all these hypocrisies that we as brown women have had to watch happen. And many of us have sat back silent and watching these things happen in front of us, and just find them really confusing. I remember growing
Mm.
up feeling like, okay, my body doesn't necessarily look like the ideal that I'm seeing everywhere else. Beauty was being conveyed as white bodies, hairless bodies, slim bodies, and I was everything but those things. And you want to become that ideal, right? So you think, okay, lighter skin is apparently more beautiful, hairless skin is apparently more beautiful, slimmer bodies apparently more beautiful. And if you're trying to morph into this other thing, you're literally trying to morph into this other character. And my analogy is like morphing every time. It's like a jalebi. Like every time you're trying to do this stuff,
Yeah.
you're just like turning into this jalebi because you're just, it changes with time. And that's the other thing. There's trends and fashion and context and cultural contexts that change with time. One day thin eyebrows are in fashion, the next day thick eyebrows are in fashion. We all know that story. I remember when I first plucked my eyebrows, oh my god, they were
Oh
just
my
like,
God.
yeah, we've all got those horror stories. I know we all do. And now thicker eyebrows are in fashion.
Totally.
And who knows, that's probably going to change again. So the premise of that chapter is that things are always going to change in terms of what a beauty ideal is. So it's about time we feel really secure in our own bodies and who we are and find those beautiful, and that all bodies are normalized, whether they are hairless bodies, whether they are bodies with hair, whatever it is,
Mm.
they are normalized. And when we're making these choices should come from a point of and a space of empowerment, not from a
Mm.
space of insecurity, and not in a space of fear of wanting to look a certain way, or to impress somebody, or doing it for men, which was another heavy theme that came up, that women felt like they needed to do these things to get a guy, or to keep their partner, or to make their husband happy. So yeah, really, really kind of challenging some of those things. And body hair was one of the popular topics, because we as brown women, we are hairy, so we have another layer to deal with when it comes to beauty
Yep.
standards. And the other one that came up quite prominently was to do with colorism, and the amount of toxicity that comes with this issue of colorism, because there's a lot that comes with it. There's the historical, cultural, class,
Mm.
caste issues that come with skin color, that I really wanted to highlight in this book, about historically where did these things come from. And there was a number
Mm.
of different reasons. There was kind of the colonial issues to do with seeing white people as superior, but there were even issues going further back than that, in looking at kind of some of the
Mm.
caste systems going on in the Asian world. But what made no sense is why these things are still happening today.
Mm.
Why in 2022 are we still believing in these same things about white skin being more beautiful, and the amount of money that's going into that industry? And you probably saw some of those figures about multi-billion dollar industries that are making money and
God.
profit off the fact that we want to have lighter skin. Is just, yeah, crazy.
Horrifying.
But yeah, ultimately that chapter is getting us to reflect on all these influences around us, these kind of hypocrisies going around us, and just getting to a place of loving our bodies, no matter what form they
Mm.
are in, so that we can feel that we are making the right choices for our body, and feeling empowered in our bodies.
Definitely. And, and obviously this goes hand in hand with all the issues regarding commodification
Mm.
and also cultural appropriation. And so how do we stop this from happening, especially, the commodification and the appropriation of like Asian culture,
Mm.
or any other non-dominant culture?
Yeah, no, definitely. And it's come up recently that the cultural appropriation one's been a really hot topic for the last couple of years, because I think people are starting to become more aware of it when it's happening. We're seeing it on TV shows, on runways, we're seeing it happen in fashion industries. And I think people are starting to understand a bit more about what it feels like when your cultural elements are being taken by perhaps a more dominant culture, and they are being commodified. People are making money out of them, all kind of completely erasing where they have come from. And I think
Mm.
that's what people sometimes haven't quite figured out yet, about what cultural appropriation actually is. And it is this
Mm.
unequal cultural exchange. that when the host community, so the South Asian community where these things come from, they haven't been able to reap the benefits of having those cultural items. They've been criticized for it. We've been bullied for it. There's examples I've given of what my mum had to go through when she wore a salwar
Mm.
kameez. She was being called every name under the sun. But now we can see them on white women and they're not being treated in that same way at all. So there's that unequal culture exchange. However, we can appreciate one another's cultures without appropriating
Mm.
them. And I really kind of laid out really clear examples in the book about how you can appreciate one another's cultures without
Mm.
appropriating them, and where I've even given examples of where it is okay to wear a lenga or a
Yeah.
sari or salwar kameez because it makes sense in this context. For example, if you're going to your best friend's wedding, and she is Asian and you want to feel kind of a part of that wedding, if it's appropriate to wear it there in that context, then that makes sense because you're kind of a guest in that
Mm.
circumstance. Other places that you might get away with it is, say, if you're going on holiday to that country, you're a tourist in that country, you kind of get like a get out of jail free card. You might get a little miss there. Okay, you're in that country, fine. However, it doesn't make sense for you to wear it as a costume to a Halloween
Mm.
party. That makes no
Oh my
sense at
God.
all. That's offensive, in a multitude of different ways. So I've really laid it out and given people kind of the step by step stages they can ask themselves when they're about to wear something or about to do something. Go through these steps. Is it significant to that host community? Can it be offensive to that host
Mm.
community? Are you doing something that doesn't feel right in this specific
Mm.
circumstance? And then reassess if you should be doing it. And I think that should hopefully help communities that aren't South Asian. So if it is white women or white
Mm.
men or communities outside the South Asian community, but also us as brown women, centering us again. And that's what that
Mm.
chapter kind of ends with, this message of no matter what, people are going to make mistakes and these things are going to happen. But the
Mm.
more sure that we feel of ourselves and the more that we own our own cultures and own our own identities,
Yeah.
the better it will become. Because I think maybe perhaps that's where the problem has been. We haven't been able to own who we are, our
No.
cultures, and all the beautiful things that make up our culture and identity before. Now we can own it. And we can own it much safer than perhaps our parents could or our grandparents could,
Mm.
especially those that have
Yeah.
migrated to the Western world. My mum in the 70s, in the 80s, may not have felt safe in those clothes. Hopefully we don't feel that same way now. So it has been
Mm.
a big shift that's happened in the last 3 decades. So yeah, no, very, very hot topic, quite a confusing one.
Indeed.
Cultural appropriation. I get loads of questions, people asking me, well, you wear white people's clothes or you wear Western clothes, so you're appropriating them. Well, no,
Oh
that's not
God.
appropriation because that has been a dominant cultural class for a very long time. So it's not like that host community didn't benefit from it. They have been
No.
dominant for a very long time. So that isn't appropriation. So
No.
I
And
think
also,
sometimes people get
it's
mixed up on what it
assimilation.
means. Yeah, it's assimilation. It's
Yeah, and
us
we have
trying
the assimilation.
to
Yeah.
fit into your standards. So yeah, hopefully that chapter has really broken it down in the best and clearest way possible. But ultimately, what it can feel like when these things happen too.
Yeah, no, completely. And you're right in terms of saying that us trying to sort of regain and reclaim our culture is so important, especially, as you say in your chapter on parenthood,
Mm,
we're going to obviously sort of pass on all of this to our children. So,
mm.
okay, so this is going to be a bit of a difficult question, especially
Mhm.
since it's so broad, which
Yeah.
is, what is your best tip for raising a brown feminist?
Oh, yeah. Ah, the parenthood chapter, raising a brown feminist. I, my best piece of advice, I guess it's a really overarching one. It's going to sound really broad, but making our girls feel like they are celebrated
Mm.
and equal to their male counterparts, to their brothers, to the boys. I think if we're doing that from the outset, if we do that from the moment a girl is born, then we can only work up from that place. And I think that's a key theme from the book, that
Mm.
unfortunately, us as brown girls and brown women, we were never given this strong foundation of self love and this strong
No.
foundation of loving who we are as brown girls and brown women. Because many of us did grow up hearing these little niggly things of boys being preferred over girls, or girls having to
Hmm.
do all the housework whilst our brothers sat on the sofa, and being told that our only aspiration in life is to get married and have babies, and being told all these things from the moment we're born. So I think the biggest and best piece of advice I can give for raising a brown feminist is really celebrate their life from the moment they're born, and make them feel
Mm.
like their voice is heard, make them feel like they're valid, and make them feel like they are worthy. And that isn't
Mm.
hard. It's not like we have to do anything particularly new or different. It just means celebrating them from the moment, from their outset. And that's the best piece of life of advice. And all parents obviously want that for their children, whether it is a boy or whether it
Mm.
is a girl. They want them to feel happy. They want them to be healthy. They want them to live the best life possible. You would want that for any of your children, regardless of their gender.
Mm.
So to make sure our girls are feeling that way from the very beginning is probably my best piece of advice.
No, and it's good advice because actually, it's not also just about celebrating them now, isn't it? Is it the big issue is obviously now protecting them
Mm,
on like things like social media, which is obviously how the book kind of ends, which is
mm,
how do we protect like brown girls and women on social media, because it can
mm,
be really vicious. We're both on social media, and especially you, where you're very visible, and
mhm,
suddenly it's just awful. Suddenly these beacon of
mm.
trolls
Mm.
just suddenly come, so it's like, how do you deal with that?
Yeah, no, really good link between the parenthood chapter and then kind of going into this digital age, because it's something I'm considering. Obviously, I haven't got kids yet, but hopefully in the near future, I do want to start a family. I do want to have kids, and we're going to be raising them in this digital world, right? There's screens everywhere you look,
Yeah.
us included. We have our phones on us all the time. How are we going to raise them in
Yep.
this new world? And I think a lot of it kind of follows on from that parenthood chapter of making sure that our girls feel as confident and as strong in themselves as possible, as secure in themselves as
Mm.
possible, that they know who they are, they know where they come from, they know they've got a family who supports them. That was a key thing that came
Yeah.
out the parenthood chapter, about this idea that kids should be able to go to their parents for anything, the good, the bad, the ugly,
Mm.
that they can turn to us as a safe place, as a place of trust, no matter what they're going through. So that when it comes to navigating things like the digital age, we've kind of set that right foundation. And yeah, that final chapter is really bringing it into the current decade of we as Asian
Mm.
women have used the digital space as a way to navigate our identity, to educate ourselves, to learn about who we are, to connect with other Asian women, even like ourselves. I wouldn't
Mm.
have been able to meet you without this digital space.
No,
So there is
exactly.
this amazing sense of kind of sisterhood and solidarity that's formed in the digital space. And I think that's really beautiful. And one of the kind of really important findings of the book, that I think we're in a place in history that's never happened before for Asian women. This kind of sense of sisterhood and solidarity has never
Mm.
happened before in human history since pre-partition. Pre
Mm.
1947, I think Asian women may have felt this kind of sense of sisterhood, whether it was a Muslim woman, Hindu woman, Sikh woman, no
Yeah.
matter what
Hmm.
background you came from, because geographically we were all mixed and jumbled together, and that was really wonderful.
Yeah.
But post partition, there was a lot of separation. After the collapse of the empire, all those sorts of things has impacted kind of this separation that's gone on. But now in the
Hmm.
digital age, I feel like we're all kind of coming back together and feeling this sense of sisterhood, which is really beautiful. However, there
Absolutely.
is a very, very dark side of social media. And this is why I say I have this love hate relationship with it, because we have to remember that this digital space, social media platforms, they were not built for us. They were not built with our liberation in mind. They weren't built to help us. They were social media platforms. We are users.
Yeah.
Is the only other place that people are called users are in kind of the drug addict world, right?
God.
So we are
Oh yeah.
users.
I
If you think
remember that documentary.
that
Yes.
social dilemma documentary, woof, that woke me up. But how do we
Yep.
navigate that, especially as women of color? People really want to attack women of color online, especially if they are
Mm,
opinionated, if they're owning their voice. People just don't like to see that. So I have
no.
seen what that looks like: the troll attacks, the death threats, the rape threats, and they were terrifying.
God.
So my advice in that chapter is how to navigate that space safely, how to use digital media and social media as a tool, how to set some boundaries with it, thinking about how much time you spend on it. But ultimately,
Mm,
how can we bring this sense of sisterhood and solidarity, that the positive sides of social media, how can we make sure that's happening in the real world too, in physical spaces too? Because I think
mm,
there's something really beautiful about human connection, being in the same room with one another. And don't get me wrong, obviously since the pandemic, a lot of our connection has been through screens, just because that's the way the world has been. But I think moving
yeah.
forward, how can we make sure there's still that going on in the real world too? Because say if all these social media platforms collapse, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, TikTok, Snapchat, I don't know how many there are. Say they
Yeah.
all
I
disappear.
can't even remember.
Yeah, say they all collapse. And WhatsApp. I'm going to include WhatsApp within that too.
Mm,
Are we going to make sure that we still have this sense of sisterhood and solidarity going on? Are we still doing things in our community spaces anymore, in our
yeah.
educational institutions anymore? There's something we really do need to consider. Um,
Mm,
if all those things were to disappear, are we still carrying this on? So yeah, that's it.
mm,
That last chapter is perhaps one of the most important ones, because it's now thinking what happens next. What's the next chapter now for Asian women? And that's up to us to decide. And I think that's really empowering. The question has lots. The book has lots of answers, but it also has lots of questions as well for
yeah.
people to go away and think about. And maybe there'll be a Brown Girl Like Me 2.0, where we kind of work on some of those questions and we think about what this next stage is going to look like for Asian women. But it is in our hands, and I think that's really empowering.
No, definitely. And that was food for thought for sure. Because,
Mm.
yeah, I was just like, true. Didn't even think of the fact that, if there is no social media,
Mm.
will we still have a sisterhood? That's really
Mm.
important for sure. And oh God, yeah. And it makes me
Mm.
want to think, okay, really solidify those relationships, I guess,
Mm. Mm.
offline. Yeah. As you were saying, there's, yeah, some great organizations out there, thankfully,
Yeah,
doing the work, which is fantastic.
yeah.
And well, Jaspreet, I just have to say, like, thank you so much for spending all this time with me and like my inordinate amount of questions that I've just inundated with you.
Amazing
So
questions.
I
I loved
apologize.
them. They were really beautiful, really thorough, really thoughtful, and I can tell you've really kind of picked out themes within the book that are really connected with you, and that's what I want, right? That I hope people read this book and find things that connect with them, find things that help educate them, help them heal. That's the real aim of this
Mm,
book. So thank you so much.
no, thank you. I'm so excited when it's out, February the 17th.